Here we're going to start to talk about the divisions of the nervous system. And for the divisions of the nervous system, you're already familiar with the difference between what's called the central nervous system, being the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, being all of the nerves that come out from the brain, being the cranial nerves, and all of the nerves that come out from the spinal cord, being the spinal nerves. And we've spent quite a bit of time talking about these sensory components. So the sensory components are those sensory nerves that are connected to the dorsal root ganglia or the sensory ganglia, the cranial sensory ganglia out in the peripheral nervous system. These send their information into the central nervous system via the ascending tracts. And then we've talked about the motor components, as far as these would be things that originate inside the brain or the spinal cord within nuclei inside the brain or spinal cord, and then send the information out to the peripheral nerves via the descending tracts, where then those motor components in the periphery respond. Here we're going to focus a little bit more on the peripheral nervous system and the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. We could divide the peripheral nervous system into the sensory components and the motor components. And we've done this. We've looked a lot at the sensory division in terms of the somatic senses, and a lot of those somatic senses we're thinking of exteroreceptors, which are giving us information about the external world. There's also all of the interoreceptors, which give us information about our internal world. These are things that we may not think about a lot, but definitely things that we need to regulate, such as our blood osmolality, our blood pressure. We have these internal receptors that send information about these things like the pH of our blood and the blood pressure to our central nervous system as well. So we are constantly receiving, or our brain is constantly receiving input from our world, both our external and our internal world, from these sensory receptors. And then last week we spent some time looking at the special senses, as far as getting some special types of information, such as information about the photo, the visual information from the world, and then the hearing information from the world. So getting a lot of these other types of special sensory modalities. We've spent some time looking at this sensory division. Now we're going to start to look at the motor division a little bit more carefully. And what we've talked about already for the motor division would be called the somatic motor nervous system. Because what we mean by the somatic division, this is going to be all of our skeletal muscles. And so when you think about moving, you think about contracting your skeletal muscles. That's considered the somatic division of our nervous system that regulates these skeletal muscles and moves our body. A lot of this muscular moving is going to be consciously controlled when we decide, oh, I want to move my arm, and then the somatic division of our peripheral nervous system conveys that innervation to those muscles and causes the muscles to move. What we're going to talk about today then is some of the things that we're not conscious of. And this would be things governed by the autonomic division of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. What the autonomic division of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system does is it regulates things such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So unlike the somatic division does your skeletal muscles. So that's what you think about for conscious moving and voluntary control. What the autonomic nervous system is going to do is going to be involuntary control. So sometimes I think of autonomic as automatic, because it's things that your peripheral nervous system does automatically. And so this is going to be innervation to things like smooth muscle. And we have smooth muscle around places like our blood vessels. So the smooth muscle in our blood vessels would allow our blood vessels to constrict. Or if you relax the smooth muscles, it allows those blood vessels to dilate. We have smooth muscles in a lot of our internal organs. And then also the autonomic nervous system innervates our cardiac muscle, which is going to control our heart rate and the force of contraction. And then also other things are going to be things like our glands, as far as when our glands are making their secretions. So autonomic nervous system is going to be governing these involuntary control of these muscles that are not skeletal muscles. I think that would be one big word that would kind of sum up all of these muscles and glands, would be that they're not skeletal muscles, because the skeletal muscles are our voluntary control. And so when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk about what's called the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Let's take a big picture look at what's happening, though, before we get too far into the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So in this picture, we're seeing kind of a flow chart that allows us to think about what happens in response to a stimulus. So let's start here on the flow chart. It starts by you see a bear. So that's our stimulus, that's our input. We get this information about the bear from our sensory division of our peripheral nervous system. So this is going to conduct action potentials to the central nervous system. Maybe this is coming from your visual, your optic nerve is going into your brain and saying, I see a bear. Or maybe it's from your olfactory receptors sending information, and I smell a bear. Or maybe it's from your vestibular cochlear nerve in your ear saying, oh, I hear something that sounds funny. I hear a bear. And hopefully it's not your somatic senses saying, I touched a bear. But in any case, some sort of sensory input goes to your brain saying, hey, I think that there's a bear out here. The central nervous system processes this information, integrates it, maybe compares the visual input to pictures that you've seen of a bear or information that you have about what you should do when you see a bear. But your central nervous system is going to integrate this information based on what you know. And your central nervous system is then going to give you some motor output. Now, what we think about, or what we've talked about so far when we think about motor output, is all the somatic nervous system. Because what I mean by that is what we tend to think about is this conscious control of motor output to our skeletal muscles, causing us to do something like what this guy is doing, which is running the heck away from the bear. So that would be the somatic nervous system, so our conscious control of our skeletal muscles response. Also, at the same time, we're going to have the autonomic motor division respond as well. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today, is these kind of controls that are going to come automatically from the autonomic nervous system. And that's going to give us input to places like our cardiac muscle. When you see the bear, probably your heart rate is going to go up quite a bit. And to smooth muscles. So things that will happen here are going to be the blood vessels in our skeletal muscles will probably dilate to give more blood flow to those skeletal muscles. Whereas the blood vessels inside some of our internal organs, like our digestive organs, will constrict, because there's no reason to be sending a lot of blood through your digestive tract when you're running from a bear. So this would redirect that blood flow to the skeletal muscle to enable you to move faster. And then our glands would be active. We might have some adrenal gland release of the adrenaline, which will also impact these same places. And then also perhaps our sweat glands would get active in order to prepare us to run. So these types of outputs are what we're going to be looking at today, the automatically controlled autonomic nervous system outputs. Now, for the autonomic nervous system, there's going to be two separate divisions, and they're called the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. And these two divisions kind of act in balance with one another. The idea being, if you have more sympathetic output, you're going to have less parasympathetic. Or by contrast, if you have more parasympathetic, the amount of sympathetic output will decrease. So these kind of act against one another, and we would describe a person as having a lot of sympathetic activity, or on a different day or a different hour, we might describe them as having a lot of parasympathetic activity. So it's a one or the other tends to be in charge of the body at the time. So the difference between the parasympathetic output versus the sympathetic output can kind of be described as the difference between rest and digest versus fight or flight. So these are the contrast. Parasympathetic says, oh, everything's fine. Let's rest and digest and relax. So when you're having a lot of parasympathetic control, you're feeling very relaxed. By contrast, if you're having a lot of sympathetic nervous system control, then you're feeling the fight-flight response. And these two would be the same thing, because whether you're going to run away from something or fight something, your body needs to respond in the same way. So this could be described as the fight-flight response, which is all elicited by the sympathetic nervous system. So sometimes I think of this as, oh, your sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that's sympathetic to the fact that you just saw a bear. Though I will say that, bears are not actually that dangerous, depending on how you respond to them. I don't mean to give bears a bad name in general. They're very... anyway, that's not the point. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is going to do things that will prepare you to either run away or fight the bear. And so things that you would need to do for that, the sympathetic nervous system will do things like dilate your pupil. What this does is it allows more light to enter the eye. And the more light that enters the eye, the more information that enters the eye. So dilating the pupil is going to allow you to take in more visual input. Another thing the sympathetic nervous system will do is stop the flow of saliva. So the reason for this is because you need saliva over here on the other side for rest and digest. When you're running from a bear, there's really no reason to be producing a lot of saliva. And so this would be things like suddenly your mouth dries out when you get really the sympathetic response. Of course, your heartbeat will accelerate, so this allows you to pump more blood to the muscles so that you can do things like fight or flight. And your bronchi and your lungs will dilate, so this increases airflow so that you can get more oxygen in and more carbon dioxide out as you're preparing to fight or flight with that bear. It will do things to the digestive system, such as inhibit. Peristalsis is the movement of your digestive organs. So this is like your intestines pushing food along its tract. And so this would actually stop. This is going to be activated on the other side as you're resting and digesting. But when you're running from a bear, you actually need to stop some of those gut movements, because we're going to rededicate the energy that would be given here to things like running from the bear. So along with the saliva stopping, your digestive tract is going to slow down, because that's not where we want the resources going. Your liver, however, will mobilize some of its stored glycogen and free up that glucose. This is also so that we can give that resource to the muscles for fighting or flighting. So we're actually going to mobilize our stores of glucose back out into the bloodstream and increase the amount of glucose available to the muscles. And then the adrenal gland, which sits atop the kidney, the adrenal gland will release adrenaline. And then that adrenaline will also affect all of these processes. And then finally, the fight-flight response will inhibit bladder contraction, so make it less likely that, because this would be something that you would need to do when you're resting and digesting. You can go and have a pee, but while you're fighting or flighting, we're actually going to inhibit that. So these are all the things that your sympathetic nervous system does. The parasympathetic nervous system is actually going to send innervation to all the same targets. So you'll notice in these pictures that all of the targets, the organs targeted by these nerves, are going to be the same. You can kind of see a little sneak peek in this picture. There's going to be some difference in the anatomy as far as how these things are wired and what regions of the central nervous system you have the output coming from. But then ultimately the targets are going to be the same. They're just going to be opposite. So parasympathetic is our rest and digest. Everything is fine. So we're going to do things like constrict the pupil, because there's less going on. Maybe we need less information from the world. So as we relax, our pupil constricts and we take in less information. Saliva flow can increase, because this is important for digestion and kind of goes along with stimulation of movements of the digestive tract. So both of those two things will increase. Our heart rate can slow down because we're resting and digesting, and the bronchi would actually constrict, which is just the opposite of what we saw for the sympathetic. So this is, we're no longer going to dilate them, but we're actually going to constrict the bronchi a little bit because we need less airflow because we're just laying here doing nothing. The liver, instead of mobilizing things like glucose, the liver will relax. And one of the things that the liver does is it releases bile. This is actually, you think of it as coming from your gallbladder. Initially, your liver makes it and your gallbladder stores it. But that bile can be stored in the gallbladder, or if you're actually digesting something, bile is released into the digestive organs to help emulsify the fats that you're digesting. And then the last one here, you'll contract the bladder because now when you are resting and digesting, now you can move the intestines and have a bowel movement, or move the bladder and release urine. So this is going to be the difference in the things that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system cause your body to do. And here we saw that they're kind of acting in contrast to one another. So if you have a lot of sympathetic activity, you're going to have very little parasympathetic activity. And if you have a lot of rest and digest activity, you're going to have very little fight-flight behavior. So they're acting in contrast with one another, or in opposition with one another. Okay, and then finally, we're going to see that there's going to be some anatomical differences between the autonomic nervous system. We're going to see some differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, and we're going to look at those in detail in the next video. Here, though, I just want to give a big contrast between the anatomical differences of the somatic nervous system, which is what we've looked at so far, and then the autonomic nervous system in general. And so if we can start by kind of seeing these differences, and what we've learned so far for muscle control, because remember, this is all divisions of the motor nervous system. Both somatic, motor, and autonomic nervous are governing motor and muscles. It's just this is skeletal, and down here we're at smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, and then glands. But there's going to be some differences in the anatomy. And what we know so far about the somatic motor nervous system is that it begins with a motor neuron, which is in the spinal cord. This is our lower motor neuron. We looked at this in great detail previously. So the lower motor neuron cell body sits inside the spinal cord in the gray matter, which doesn't have the myelination. So there's that cell body sitting in the spinal cord. And the axon exits the spinal cord via what's called the motor root, and then joins with axons from the sensory side of things inside what's called the spinal nerve. And then we talk about how the spinal nerve may or may not mix with other axons within the plexuses, and we talked about that more so in lab. But then eventually the axon will reach a skeletal muscle and release neurotransmitters that cause the skeletal muscle to contract. For the autonomic nervous system, we kind of start the same way. Look, here's a cell body in the spinal cord. Now you can see right away that the location of the cell body in the spinal cord is a little bit different. For the somatic division, you see it's more in the anterior horns. And then for the autonomic division, we're going to find it more in the lateral horns. So it's positioned a little bit differently for the cell body, but then its axon still exits the spinal cord via the motor root. So that's the same because it's part of the motor division. And then those axons will join with other axons, the sensory axons, at the spinal nerve. So that's kind of the same. The axons are still within a spinal nerve. But then our first difference is right here. The autonomic nervous system, its first neuron is called a preganglionic neuron. And that's because this neuron is going to extend to a ganglia. So that it gets the name preganglionic neuron because it comes before this ganglia. And this ganglia is given just a very broad name, the autonomic ganglia, which you kind of have to like because it's part of the autonomic nervous system. So good little naming system there. And what a ganglia always is it's going to be this cluster of cell bodies. That's what a ganglia is. So here is a ganglia, and among these clusters of cell bodies, what these cell bodies are these cell bodies for the second neuron, which is named the postganglionic neuron. So you kind of got to love the naming system. You have the neuron that comes before the ganglion is the preganglionic neuron. And then the neuron that comes after the ganglia is called the postganglionic neuron. The only thing that gets a little confusing about the naming system that you want to keep in mind is the postganglionic neuron, its cell body is the autonomic ganglia. So it's called the postganglionic neuron. I almost wish it was called the ganglionic neuron because it is the neuron whose cell body is the ganglia, because what a ganglia is a cluster of cell bodies. So I kind of wish that it could just be named the ganglionic neuron because it's a neuron whose cell body is in the ganglia. But it's not. It's a neuron. It's called the postganglionic neuron. And then this postganglionic neuron's axon will go all the way out to the target muscle, which is smooth muscle, and shown here as maybe the intestine. So it goes out to the intestine and causes more intestinal movement or less, depending on if we're looking at sympathetic or parasympathetic axons. Okay, so that kind of gives you a little bit of a sneak peek of the anatomy. In the next video, we're going to look at this anatomy in a little bit more detail, or actually a lot more detail.